Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. The last 3 weeks now, we've been looking at the social gospel and its fallout. This week, I want to be looking at what's going on today in our own time, and I'm calling it Churches Finding the Next Big Cause. We are, after all, going toward the 3rd century of the social gospel. So what has it done during this time period? And we know, as we've been tracing it, it is still going on as a concept in American Protestantism. But, where is it today and where might it go in the next few years? I should point out, for example, this came out in November, from National Public Radio, Religion Provoked by Trump, the religious left is finding its voice. This has been a persistent question throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We know that the religious right makes a big headway in terms of politics and how they're able to shape politics. We know that the news media will go ask a religious right person when any particular social issues are involved. But what about a religious left? Where are they? Did they disappear after the civil rights movement of the 1960s? And that's been a persistent question. Will they ever come back? Because in the 70s, of course, the rise of the religious right was very, very noticeable. Well, one of the people who is around today shaping what that is going to look like is William J. Barber II, born in 1963. So he doesn't remember, obviously, the civil rights movement of the early to mid 1960s, but he is very consciously modeling what he does on that. One of his organizations is called Repairers of the Breach. That is, of course, a reference to Isaiah. He is also co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and the Poor People's Campaign is very consciously, again, modeled on the Poor People's Campaign that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was involved with at the end of his life. That is what he was doing in Memphis when he was assassinated. Mr. Barber, Reverend Barber, is also an NAACP national board member, and he is a minister in the Disciples of Christ tradition. Now, those of you who have been watching closely remember 3 weeks ago when I started talking about the social gospel movement that the Disciples of Christ were one of the central denominations, Protestant denominations involved in the original social gospel movement. So here they are, still there, a very liberal Protestant denomination. Reverend Barber also started the Moral Mondays back in 2013 that have become very popular. Many people saw him speak in the 2016 Democratic National Convention, and he was recently chosen as a MacArthur Fellow. That's the Genius Grant that gives people a bit over $100,000 a year to do as they wish with, to further the causes that these very smart people are involved in. One of his books, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. And again, that's going to be a persistent theme that's going to go on over and over again in Barber's work, is this idea that we have a new justice movement. It's new and improved from the great 1960s civil rights movement. I mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Now, what I want to do as we look at this is to go back to the first broad statement from the social gospel people back in 1908. At that time, it was the Federal Council of Churches that later became the National Council of Churches in 1950. And I'm going to put their agenda back in 1908 in red so we can look at what they did accomplish and what they didn't accomplish and how that kind of meshes. 1908, now it's been a long time, but some things have happened and some things haven't. Well, one of their things back in 1908 was protection of the worker from dangerous machinery, occupational disease, injuries, and mortality. Of course, we do now have a national group, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It is funded and enforced or not, according, of course, to American politics in terms of the fluctuations within that. But there is now a federal agency that does do what they wanted to do back in 1908. The abolition of child labor, that did occur in the early New Deal period, except for farm labor, which is still unregulated today. The regulation of the conditions of toil for women, as shall safeguard the physical and moral health of the community. That one, as I mentioned when I first read it, is a little bit off and odd because it probably meant at that time getting women out of the workforce and into the home, but which it definitely doesn't mean nowadays. But we do have now a federal agency, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We know that so far women do not make the same as men in the U.S. in many, many fields, but we do at least have, again, something out there to enforce laws, if they are ever enforced. We shall see. Well, let's go back to the Poor People's Campaign agenda. Enact comprehensive and just COVID-19 relief that provides free testing, treatment, vaccines, and direct payments to the poor. Would be nice. That is obviously would not have been a part of the agenda in 1908. And we will see how that works out. But that is one of the goals of the Poor People's Campaign. 2, guarantee quality health care for all, regardless of any pre-existing conditions. This harkens back to the old 1908 idea of provision for old age of the workers and for those incapacitated by injury. We did indeed get Social Security in the New Deal era after 1908, but we're still working on this, of course, with Obamacare, et cetera. It's still a political football in the U.S. Another agenda of the Poor People's Campaign is raise the minimum wage to $15 hourly immediately. The campaign for 15, that rhymes exactly with 1908, a living wage as a minimum in every industry. We do have a federal minimum wage, but it again, is a political football, goes up and down according to various politics that are going on in the U.S. $15 has been estimated, as we'll see in a moment, as a livable wage within most of the U.S. It is debatable. But for example, in Minneapolis, we have a city ordinance that says people get $15 an hour. Number 4, update the poverty measure. And of course, in 1908, it was the abatement of poverty. This is, again, very important in the thinking of the Poor People's Campaign. How do we measure poverty? The fact is that the federal measure for poverty today is based on a formula that comes from the 1960s. In the 1960s, food was 1/3 of a poor person's budget, consumed 1/3 of the budget. And now poverty is calculated on the cost of food. However, during these several decades since the 1960s, the cost of food has fallen for most Americans. The American food supply is, number 1, subsidized by the federal government, which makes the cost artificially low. Also, our food chain tends to be very cheap and fast, not generating often healthy food, but it does generate a lot of food. And so food is probably not the best measure of poverty anymore. Cost. We need to maybe figure in things like medical care, child care, and housing. With that kind of poverty measure, the Poor People's Campaign claims that roughly 43% of Americans now live in poverty. The federal calculations show about 12%. So you can see there's a vast difference in what is considered poor and how we reach what is poor in America. Number 5, guarantee quality housing for all. That, of course, is one of the main things that First Unitarian Society is involved in with the downtown clergy in the city of Minneapolis. It is an ongoing problem, but it is something that we work on all the time. Number 6, enact a federal jobs program to build up investments, infrastructure, public institutions, climate resilience, energy efficiency, and socially beneficial industries and jobs in poor and low-income communities. I threw in a little picture there with Reverend Barber with the leadership of the United Auto Workers. He is very pro-union in building these kinds of ideas up. You probably also know with the first Poor People's Campaign, campaign, the Dr. Martin Luther King was very involved with labor unions, and they were one of the main financiers of the civil rights campaigns of the 1960s. So very important part of any poor people's campaign in the eyes of our ministers. Number 7, protect and expand voting rights and civil rights. That goes back to 1908 with our equal rights and complete justice for all men in all stations of life. Of course, women have since gotten the vote, yay, but we are still working to expand and protect the voting rights and civil rights of all Americans. Number 8, guarantees safe, quality, and equitable public education with supports for protection against resegregation. Again, very much a problem with the way real estate works in the United States, that we have a segregation now, not legally according to race, but certainly according to various measures of wealth and poverty. I do have a picture inserted here with the Reverend Barber. He's wearing a minister's stole that says, Jesus was a poor man. Remember that was one of the absolute beginning ideas way back in the social gospel of the 1870s, that we're not going to talk about religious tradition or religious dogma. We're going to talk about the life of Jesus, in which we're going to present him as a Palestinian, a poor Palestinian, struggling against the powers of the time. And there's Dr. Barber right there with the stole saying that yet again. Also, one of the Poor People Campaign projects is the comprehensive and just immigration reform. Number 10, ensure all the rights of indigenous peoples. Number 11, enact fair taxes and targeted tax credits. Again, the tax structures of the U.S. Do favor certain groups, and the Poor People's Campaign would like to see that a little bit reevaluated. 12, use the power of executive orders. This, of course, has come out very recently, and therefore is asking the future next president to use executive orders to reverse other executive orders and redirect the bloated Pentagon budget towards these priorities as a matter of national security. In 1908, that wasn't really a question of the time. Certainly has become one since, with the rise in spending. So there you get the idea of kind of what's going on today in a very important part of the left religious movement, religious left. Let me read you this little quote from the Reverend Barber. To suggest that when the Pope calls on us to love one another, he's being theologically orthodox, but when he challenges injustice, he is political, is to suggest that Jesus himself would not be welcome in America. And again, that goes right back to the beginning of, in the 1870s of the social gospel, the idea that we have to look at the social circumstances of the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, not at what has developed in the various theologies, and that, yes, loving one another sounds innocuous, doesn't it? And feeding the poor sounds political, but no, they're actually the same thing. Now, what I want to think about tomorrow is this. If you think back a few days ago, if you were watching, I mentioned the civil rights leader, Ella Baker, from the early 1960s, who said, my theory is strong people don't need strong leaders. So if we reflect a moment, Reverend Barber is definitely leading the kind of movement that is modeled on the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I took that apart a little bit and started talking about the fact that actually below the surface, it's really not as true as it first appears, not as true as the historical narrative has come down to most Americans. And I want to think about that a little more, about what we're going to be doing next in terms of civil rights, in terms of Poor People's Campaign, et cetera. Are we going to be looking at something that is a little less about strong leaders and a little more about social networking and that kind of thing, which is what Ella Baker was teaching us. So more on that tomorrow. Wednesday night, join us this week, ending the work week by looking at Bibles and Beer, a humanist Bible study. This week, I will be discussing the story of Noah, one of the central stories. It's popular in cartoons and song, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to ask a few questions about that narrative by looking at it, and how many animals are on the boat. because guess what? The numbers don't agree, which indicate some things about how that story is working. A little bit of humanist fun with Bibles and beer and the good old story of Noah. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.